Welcome dear students. Today our topic of deliberation is species concept. The objectives of today's deliberation are: number first, to discuss the historical development of species concept. Number second, to underline the types of species concepts. Number third, to describe in detail the taxonomic species concept. Number four, to describe in detail the biological species concept. And number fifth, to describe in detail the evolutionary species concept. So first and foremost, let's have a general introduction about the species concept. Species is the fundamental unit in biology. Species are the building bricks in biological classification, from which concepts of higher and lower groups are developed. The scientific system of naming kinds of plants and animals revolves around the species level. The term species is Latin for kinds. According to ICBN, which has attempted to clarify the meaning of the word species, species are convenient classificatory units defined by trained biologists using all information available. The word species has a dual connotation in biological science. First, species is a naturally occurring group of individual organisms that comprises a basic unit of evolution. Second, the species is a category within a taxonomic hierarchy, governed by various rules of nomenclature. Since ancient time, philosophers and naturalists realized the necessity for a basic unit by which biodiversity on this planet may be described and estimated. Darwin aptly said, "Every biologist knows approximately what is meant when we talk about species, yet no other taxon has been subjected to such violent controversies as to its definition." The word species has different meaning for different botanists. Biological species arise by an evolutionary process called as speciation. The term speciation was coined by Cook, 1906. The basic process of evolution recognizes the existence of two processes, namely anagenesis, phyletic change in the course of time. Number second, cladogenesis or speciation, the origin of new species of organisms through splitting of pre-existing ones. Species is also considered as one of the main ways by which organisms adapt in order to exploit the diversity of environments available to them. A number of possible modes of speciation have been suggested by various evolutionary biologists. Huxley suggested three types of speciation: geographical, ecological, and genetic. Mayer classified the various modes of speciation into the following types: geographic speciation, semi-geographic speciation, and non-geographic or sympatric speciation, instantaneous and gradual. Wright proposed 7 alternative modes of speciation, which are basically overlapping with each other and based on the size of population and the number of ancestral species, giving rise to new species. Mayer and Ashlock proposed 6 possible modes of speciation: polyploidy, sympatric, parapatric, geographic or allopatric, which has 2 types, dichopatric and peripatric, and speciation in time. Now let's go through second objective, that is historical development of species concept. Early Greek philosophers and naturalists like Hippocrates, Plato, and Aristotle have paid attention to biological classification, in which species is the basic unit. Hippocrates described types of animals, but there is no indication of any useful classification in his work. Plato believed in essentialism, which is also referred to as the theory of forms. He used the term eidos for forms or types. It is of Greek origin and serves to designate any of those primary realities which came to be known as the forms. Aristotle was the father of biological classification. As far as evolution is concerned, he gave the idea of ladder of life, a series in which organisms could be arranged in the order of increasing complexity. He emphasizes that all the attributes of animals, such as living, actions, habits, and bodily parts may be taken into consideration in classification. His idea was also a kind of typological or essentialism as far as species is concerned. Linnaeus, a great taxonomist and sometimes called the father of taxonomy, adhered to downward classification. His thinking was that of an essentialist, for whom species reflects the existence of fixed, unchangeable type or essence. The typological definition of species, based on the concept of Linnaeus, is called the essentialistic species concept. Dear students, from the above discussion, it will be quite evident to you that a particular species concept is associated with a definition, and definitions differ in different concepts of species. It may be mentioned here that nearly all of the older definitions of species, including those of Buffon, Lamarck, and Cuvier, refer to the morphological similarities of individuals of the same species. An entirely new concept had begun to emerge in the 17th century. John Ray believed in the morphological definition of species, and his species characterization also contained the germ of biological species concept, which considers the reproductive relationship to be a principal species criterion. As early as 1760, Kölreuter mentioned that all the individuals which are able to interbreed and produce fertile progeny belong to the same species. Buffon, in his Histoire Naturelle, described everything known in the natural world and believed in organic change, but did not provide any mechanism to explain the evolutionary change. Buffon prepared the way for biological species concept using sterility barrier instead of morphological similarities as species criterion. The biological species concept was clearly formulated by Jordan, Dobzhansky, and Mayer. According to Mayer, a species is a group of potentially or actually interbreeding natural populations which are reproductively isolated from other such groups. However, Dobzhansky, being an evolutionary genetist, defined species as a reproductive community of sexually and cross-fertilizing individuals which share in a common gene pool. The biological species concept is the most widely accepted, but it has certain difficulties in its application. Since biological species concept is applicable to non-dimensional situation, Simpson, faced with the problem of studying the evolution of species through time, proposed his evolutionary species concept, in which a species is a lineage, an ancestral descendant sequence of populations, evolving separately from others and with its own unitary evolutionary role and tendencies. Dear students, with this we have reached our second objective, that is, types of species concepts. Survey of taxonomic literature shows that there are a large number of species concepts which have been proposed from time to time. There are more than 20 species concepts which are listed below. Agamospecies, asexual lineages, uniparental organisms, parthenogens and apomixed that cluster together in terms of their genome may be secondarily uniparental from biparental ancestors. Biological species, Mendelian populations of sexually reproducing organisms interbreeding natural populations isolating from each other depending upon reproductive isolating mechanisms. Cladistic species, set of organisms between speciation events or between speciation and extinction events, or a segment of a phylogenetic lineage between nodes. Cohesion species, evolutionary lineages bounded by cohesion mechanisms that cause reproductive communities, particularly genetic exchange and ecological interchangeability. Composite species, all organisms belonging to an internodon and their descendants, until a subsequent internodon. An internodon is a set of organisms whose parent-child relationships are not split. Ecological species, a lineage which occupies an adaptive zone minimally different from that of any other lineage in its range and which evolves separately from all lineages outside its range. Evolutionary species, a lineage, ancestral descendant sequence of populations evolving separately from others and with its own unitary evolutionary role and tendencies. Evolutionary significant unit. It is a population or group of populations that is substantially reproductively isolated from other conspecific population units and represents an important component in the evolutionary legacy of the species. Genealogical concordance. Population subdivisions concordantly identified by multiple independent genetic units constitute the population units worthy of recognition as phylogenetic taxa. Genetic species, group of organisms that may inherit characters from each other, common gene pool, reproductive community that forms a genetic unit. Genotypic cluster, clusters of monotypic or polytypic biological entities identified using morphology or genetics, forming groups that have few or no intermediates when in contact. Hanegian species, a tocogenetic community that arises when a stem species is dissolved into two new species and ends when it goes extinct or speciates. Internodal species, organisms are conspecific in virtue of their common membership of a part of a genealogical network between two permanent splitting events or a splitting event and extinction. Morphological species, similar to typological species concept of Linnaeus, species are the smallest groups that are consistently and persistently distinct and distinguishable by ordinary means. Nominalistic species, only individuals exist and nothing more. Species have no actual existence in nature. Non-dimensional species, species delimitation in a non-dimensional system, a system without the dimensions of space and time. Nothospecies, species formed from the hybridization of two distinct parental species, often by polypolarity. Phenetic species, a cluster of characters that statistically co-vary, a family resemblance concept in which possession of most characters is required for inclusion in a species, but not all. Phylogenetic species, a species is the smallest diagnosable cluster of individual organisms within which there is a parental pattern of ancestry and descent. Recognition species, a species that most inclusive population of individuals, biparental organisms which share a common fertilization system. Reproductive competition species, the most extensive units in the natural economy such that reproductive competition occurs among their parts. Successional species, arbitrary anagenetic stages in morphological forms, mainly in the paleontological records. Taxonomic species, species considered by a taxonomist to be a member of a kind on the evidence or the assumption that they are as like as their offspring of hereditary relatives within a few generations. Mayer and Ashlock have stated that the innumerable species concepts as discussed above fall into four groups. The first two have mainly historical significance but are still upheld by a few contemporary authors. These groups are: number first, typological or taxonomic species concept; number second, nominalistic species concept; number third, biological species concept; and number fourth, evolutionary species concept. Let's now discuss in detail our third objective, that's taxonomic species concept. According to this concept, the species is regarded as an assemblage of individuals with morphological features in common and separable from other such assemblages by correlated morphological discontinuity in a number of features. The supporter of this view believe in the concept of continuous and discontinuous variations. The individuals of a species show continuous variations, share certain characters, and show a distinct discontinuity with individuals belonging to other species with respect to all or some of these characters. Duritz modified the taxonomic species concept by also incorporating the role of geographic distribution of populations and developed the morphogeographical species concept. The species was defined as the smallest population that is permanently separated from other population by distinct discontinuity in a series of biotypes. The populations recognized as distinct species and occurring in separate geographical areas are generally stable and remain so even when grown together. There are, however, examples of a few species pairs which are morphologically quite distinct, well adapted to respective climates, but when grown together, they readily interbreed and form intermediate fertile hybrids, bridging the discontinuity gap between the species. Examples are Platanus orientalis of the Mediterranean region and Platanus occidentalis of United States. Such pair of species are known as vicarious species or vicariants, and the phenomenon is known as vicariance or vicarism. Morphological and morphogeographical types of taxonomic species have been widely accepted by taxonomists who even take into account the data from genetics, cytology, ecology, etc., but firmly believe that species recognized must be delimited by morphological characters. The taxonomic species concept has several advantages. Number first, it is useful for general taxonomic purposes, especially the field and herbarium identification of plants. Number second, the concept is very widely applied and most species have been recognized using this concept. Number third, the morphological and geographical features used in the application of this concept can be easily observed in populations. Number four, even experimental taxonomists who do not recognize this concept apply this concept in cryptic form. The concept, however, also has some inherent drawbacks. For example, it is highly subjective and different sets of characters are used in different groups of plants. It requires much experience to practice this concept because only after considerable observation and experience can a taxonomist decide the characters which are reliable in a particular taxonomic group. The concept does not take into account the genetic relationship between plants. After this, let's talk about our fourth objective, that is biological species concept. The biological species concept was first developed by Mayer, who defined species as groups of actually or potentially interbreeding natural populations which are reproductively isolated from other such groups. Based on the same criteria, Grant defined species as a community of cross-fertilizing individuals linked together by bonds of mating and reproductively isolated from other species by barriers to mating. The recognition of biological species thus involves A. Interbreeding among populations of the same species and B. Reproductive isolation. The biological species concept is the most held conceptually by systematics. Most practicing workers would believe that the morphological differences used for the species delimitation do indeed reflect similar degrees of interbreeding and reproductive isolation. Hence, although the morphological, most workers adhere to the broader conceptual base of the biological species concept. The obvious utility of the biological species concept has spawned many applications and added perspectives. Clearly, One of the reasons for its utility is that it deals with the reproductive isolation, which is admitted by nearly all the workers to be important in evolutionary theory. The concept has several advantages. It is objective and at the same criteria is used for all the groups of plants. It has a scientific basis as the populations showing reproductive isolation do not intermix and the morphological differences are maintained even in the species grown in the same area. The concept is based on the analysis of features and does not need experience to put into practice. When applying this concept to plants, however, a number of problems are encountered. A good majority of plants show only vegetative reproduction, and hence the concept of reproductive isolation as such cannot be applied. Reproductive isolation is commonly verified under experimental conditions, usually under cultivation. It may have no relevance for wild populations. Genetic changes causing morphological differentiation and those causing reproductive barriers do not always go hand in hand. For example, Salvia mellifera and Salvia apiana are morphologically distinct, two separate species according to the taxonomic species concept, but not reproductively isolated, single species according to the biological species concept. Such species are known as compilospecies. Contrary to this, Gillian conspicua and Gillian transmontana are reproductively isolated, two separate species according to the biological species concept, but morphologically similar, single species according to the taxonomic species concept. Such species are known as sibling species. Fertility-sterility is only of theoretical value in allopatric populations. It's difficult and time-consuming to carry out fertility-sterility tests. Occurrence of reproductive barriers has no meaning in apomixed. Necessary genetic and experimental data are available for only very few species. Stebbins, it would appear, combined two concepts when he stated that species must consist of system or populations that are separated from each other by complete or at least sharp discontinuities in the variation pattern, and that these discontinuities must have a genetic basis. These populations with isolating mechanisms, different species may occur either in the same region, sympatric species, or in the different region, allopatric species. Fortunately, although the taxonomic and biological concepts are based on different principles, the species recognized by one concept in majority of cases stand the test of other. Morphology provides the evidence for putting the genetic definition into practice. Now let's deliberate about our last objective, that is evolutionary species concept. This concept was developed by Magelich, Simpson and Wiley. Simpson defined the species as a lineage and ancestral descendant sequence of populations evolving separately from others and with its own unitary evolutionary role and tendencies. Although maintaining that interbreeding among sexually reproducing individuals is an important component in species cohesion, this concept is compatible with broad range of reproductive modes. Wiley defines an evolutionary species is a single lineage of ancestor descendant populations which maintains its identity from other such lineages and which has its own evolutionary tendencies and historical fate. Because of non-dimensional character of the biological species concept, some paleontologists are not satisfied with biological species definition. Their argument is that species definition must involve evolutionary criteria. Mayer has criticized the evolutionary species definition, saying that it is the definition of a phyletic lineage but not of species. It is also applicable to incipient species or isolated populations. Further, it ignores the core of the species problem and tries to delimit species taxa in the time dimension. This concept avoids many of the problems of the biological concept lineage. Lineage is a single series of demes, populations that share a common history of descent, not shared by other demes. The identity of species is based on a recognition system that operates at various levels. Viewed from the standpoint of evolutionary species concept, however, the important question is not whether the two species hybridize, but whether two species do or do not lose their distinct ecological and evolutionary roles. If despite some hybridization they do not merge, then they remain separate species in the evolutionary perspective. Several other terms have been proposed to distinguish species based on specific criteria. For example, Grant recognizes microspecies as populations of predominantly uniparental plant groups, which are themselves uniform and are slightly differentiated morphologically and from one another. They are often restricted to a limited geographical area. Microspecies develop in inbreeding species but are usually not stable over longer periods. They may undergo cross-fertilization sooner or later, forming recombinant types which themselves become new microspecies. The term microspecies was first suggested by Jordan. Microspecies are distinct from cryptic species, which are morphologically similar but cytologically or physiologically different. Stace uses the term semi-cryptic species for the latter. Dear students, let's conclude here. Species is a basic unit of biological classification and a taxonomic rank. Traditionally, species have been considered as a basic category of biological classification and defined as a group of similar organisms showing the same essence, which is based on typological species concept, essentialism. Later on, in the 18th century, the typological species definition was found inappropriate for biological species. So mainly in the second half of the 19th century, an entirely new species concept, biological species concept, was developed, which was elaborated in detail by Mayer and Dobzhansky in 20th century. Biological species concept is the most widely accepted species concept. Later on, Wiley and Simpson proposed the evolutionary concept of species, defining species as a lineage, an ancestral descendant sequence of populations, evolving separately from others and with its own unitary evolutionary role and tendencies. So we can conclude that there are a large number of species concepts proposed from time to time by various naturalists, taxonomists, and evolutionists which define species in different manner. Consequently, there are various models to explain the different modes of speciation, but broadly speaking, speciation occurs via polyploidy, sympatric speciation, parapatric speciation, and allopatric speciation mechanisms. Dear students, this brings us to end of this lecture on species concept. Hope you have enjoyed this lecture. Have a nice day.